So our next speaker is Eliot, and Eliot had a really, really brilliant idea. And I don't know if this was the genesis of it, but I've had some really tripped out, interesting conversations in my life when I've been on hikes. And yeah, pretty interesting conversations, trust me. I don't want to go too into that. But I think when you're in that setting with a guide, it's an opportunity to talk, to think, and to learn. And Eliot realized that there might not be enough going on right now in terms of people who are guiding these tours of national parks having the climate literacy to educate their audience about it. And it turned out he did an inquiry and determined that there was demand for climate change education among these guides. And Eliot designed a really cool course. And I think that this project absolutely epitomizes a capstone that just identifies a need, meets the need, is well executed, independently executed, and done by a student who was so much fun to have in this program and so much fun to just talk with and hang out with, and is going to have a really impressive, impactful career. And I think we all know that in the cohort. So Eliot, really proud of you. You're up with it.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. Thanks, Corey, for the kind words. And it means a lot to be here with all of you today. And thanks to my partner and parents and everyone else who made it here today. Let's see if I can. Here we go. Oh, yeah. Thanks. Mask off. All right, and we're on. All right. As Corey mentioned, my project, Climate Science and Communication for Mountain Guides, Program Effectiveness and Future Potential. I'm Eliot Headley, and that's Mount Rainier. So, what did I do? A short description of what I did. I went to a major mountain guiding operation that is based mostly in Mount Rainier called RMI, and I brought a half day, about a 3-hour climate change and communication workshop to the new hire guides. The goal was to try and get the guides more comfortable in talking about climate change with their clients. And so I partnered with RMI. They were gracious enough to give me the space, and the guides were there to communicate with me as well. So motivations, why did I do this? I narrowed it down to 3. 1, mountain guides already operate in areas that are severely affected by climate change. And number 2, guides are already communicators. They're walking around, they're already trained to communicate about the natural environment and the risks, so they're a natural shoe-in to talk about climate change. Also, there is this degree of trust that is developed between the client and the guide. You know, if you hire someone to be your guide, there's already that level of trust, but it also is developed throughout the tour as well. So I think that those 3 together kind of encapsulate my big motivations of why providing mountain guides with more resources to talk about climate change was really a motivation for me. So that brought me to my research question, is how effective would a program workshop be in discussing climate change and communication with mountain guides for themselves? What did I bring to this was the 3-hour course with RMI with the goal of increasing comfortability of talking about climate change with their clients for the mountain guides, but also an analysis of that program workshop after the fact and a discussion of the future potential of this program. Weaving in some theory, and this research came later after I led the course in April, and I came across some interesting research showing that engaging people emotionally could be a very important factor in talking climate change and communicating climate change with the public. And I can leave it up to you. I have some more photographs, but I'll leave it up to you to see how emotionally engaging a climb up Mount Rainier just might be. Trust also is another really important factor in talking about climate change. And like I already said, there's a developed and implied trust when you're talking with a guide and in the guiding whole environment. I guess I did want to show these photos. So take a look at those crevasse photos. So I'd hope that you would trust your mountain guide on that top left in traversing terrain like that. And the lower photograph is an image of some of the training that if you were to fall into a crevasse, the guides are there to rescue you. So that implies some of the trust that exists within the guide and the client relationship. So here, I'll leave this image up to you. Here's a photo that I took of on the route that a lot of the guides may lead clients, and I'll leave this up to you if it might be an emotionally engaging setting to talk about climate change. There's a lot of snow in this picture. It was early in the year, but yeah, that's an image of Mount Rainier. Okay, so I think that sets up a little bit what I did and what I brought. I want to take the next few minutes and talk about the slides that I brought to the mountain guides and kind of the way that I presented climate change for them. And these are the 3 points that I hinged the talk with the guides on. 1, how is Mount Rainier changing, and what are the mechanisms? And then also, how much can we attribute those changes to climate change? So I'll start with some photos. Here is a picture of a glacier on Mount Rainier from 1934. And here it is in 2017. Picture shows a lot of words, right? I'll show that once more. Here's 1934 and 2017. Here's another glacier from 1912, and that same glacier in 2019. So I think those photographs can show just how much it has changed in the past few decades on Mount Rainier, but I have some numbers to show as well. So one study I found showed a 27% decrease of glacier mass from 1913 to 1994. So I think by now it's probably safe to say that about 30% of the glacial mass on Mount Rainier has decreased since 1913. Here's a LiDAR image of the glacial mass lost from 1970 to 2016. So LiDAR just measures the elevation change. So what you're seeing here in the colors, anything that is that yellow down to red is a loss of glacier mass. And an alpine glacier should have an accumulation zone and a depletion zone. That's what a healthy glacier looks like. But these glaciers on Mount Rainier are showing a loss at all elevations and all aspects. In some areas, and a huge amount of loss as well. And if you can't read it down here at the bottom, it says some elevations have dropped 130 feet in those few decades. Yeah, so the glaciers have definitely depleted a lot. Okay, so we've established that Mount Rainier has definitely changed quite a bit. A lot of ice has been lost. Let's talk about a few of the mechanisms. And again, this is the way that I presented it to the mountain guides. Focusing on these 2 mechanisms, atmospheric rivers that cause more high elevation extreme rain events, and heat waves, like the one that we saw last June, which was pretty striking, and a lot of lives were lost in the Pacific Northwest, record temperatures in Seattle and Portland. Though some of the mountain guides had interesting observations as well during those events, and it sparked a lot of questions. The guides were saying that a lot more of their clients were asking questions about climate change because of the heat dome. I stressed with the guides, and I'll stress here today, that these are both a weather phenomenon that are going to become more frequent and more severe due to climate change. So I guess one of the questions that got brought up from a client was, oh, that was a big heat wave last week. Is that climate change? And so I get the guides to be like, well, it was a weather phenomenon, but they're going to become more frequent and more severe due to climate change. So what are the risks? These are a few that I nailed down. Rockfall absolutely is a big risk on Mount Rainier as the climate continues to change, as these extreme weather events are causing more ice to melt. Floods and washout is a particularly harsh effect that's happening to the national park infrastructure, the roads, the buildings. Exposure to heat, as we've already talked about from my colleagues, that is definitely going to be a factor. You may not think of it as climbing a mountain, being exposed to heat, but during that heat wave, some of the guides actually mentioned that they were able to be in t-shirts and shirtless on the 14,000-foot summit of Mount Rainier last June. It's pretty hot. Exposure to wildfire smoke absolutely is going to become more of a factor in the future as climate change progresses and the West Coast sees more wildfires. Here's an image from a rockfall event that happened in 2011 on Mount Rainier, and there is the arrow is pointing right to that big debris area, and there is a popular guiding route that goes actually right through that field, and some of the guides actually were there that day. They were in the workshop and were able to speak to the risk that they felt personally and for their clients on that day. One guide interestingly described Mount Rainier as a giant choss pile, which in climbing terms means loose rock. So a giant pile of loose rock held together by ice. So that image struck home for me that as this ice is melting, the rock is falling away and creating hazards for the guides and for the climbers. Wildfire smoke, absolutely. Here is an image from last summer. This is what Mount Rainier might look like in a lot of the smoky summers, which is much of the guiding season. A lot of days last year, the guides actually had to shut some of their operations down because it was too smoky. So definitely a respiratory hazard for the guides and for the clients as well. What's the driving force of all this? I mean, I talked about our extreme weather events, but behind the weather events, human-caused climate change. Here's our Keeling curve. And I showed this to the guides and really drove home the point of what CO2 means and what it's influencing for our climate and for Mount Rainier. So after all of the climate science portion, we had a communication workshop where the mountain guides were able to break into small groups and communicate with each other and practice talking about some of these questions. So some things that they may have learned before the program, but also some things that they may have learned within the program, talking about these extreme weather events, whatever it be. The guides were able to practice and hear other guides answer questions regarding climate change, questions that they may receive on tours. And then there was a breakout from those groups, and we were able to talk about what everybody learned and what stood out from a lot of the mountain guides and talk about how things could have improved as well. So I think overall it was a really dynamic and group activity. All of the guides seemed very stoked to be there, and they were able to take away, I think, a little something and add a little bit of their own as well. So how did I do? I have an assessment, so I gave a survey, and I asked 2 questions before and after the program workshop that I gave to the mountain guides. Question number 1 is, what is your current comfort level in answering questions regarding climate change during guiding operations? And question number 2, how likely are you to initiate discussion regarding climate change during guiding operations? And the guides reported their comfort level and their likelihood to initiate on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. And this is what the survey looked like. And here are some results. Question number 1. So I have each of the 5 levels of comfort grouped on the x-axis there. The before responses are there in green, the after responses are in blue, and the average of the before responses are in the small bar on the x-axis, the small green bar, and then the average of the after is the small blue bar on the x-axis, and the change in average is there in red. So in analysis of my survey, I was able to see that there was a notable increase in reported comfortability of discussing questions regarding climate change from the mountain guides. Question number 2, figure number 2. How likely are you to initiate discussions on climate change? Structured the same way, I have the 5 likelihood levels and the before in green and the after responses in blue, and also the change in average there in red. So I also saw from the survey that there was a notable increase in likelihood to talk about climate change during tours, as reported by the guides. So I was pretty excited to see these survey responses. For me, what would be really interesting as a follow-up to this project would be to follow up with the guides who actually attended the guide workshop, as well as other mountain guides that work at that same company, in another company, and just to try and bring in more voices and imagine how other guides may perform differently and see how others bring different things to the table. Surveying the clients would be really interesting if this project continues, which I hope it does. Surveying clients who went on a tour with a mountain guide that talked about climate change. If you could give a similar survey to a guided client on Mount Rainier, similar survey maybe before and after, talking about, hey, what do you feel about climate change before this experience with the guide, and then talk to them afterwards. I think that'd be some really interesting data to show. Future potential. So the guiding industry is in a really unique position to talk about climate change. Hinging off my 3 motivations to do this project, that there's already a lot of climate change effects happening in the areas that guiding is occurring. There is already communication occurring. Guides are trained communicators. And there is already this trust that exists within the guide-client dynamic. So hinging on those 3 points, I think that the guiding industry as a whole has a lot of potential to improve their understanding of climate change, their integration of climate communication during tours. And there are many guiding operations in the Pacific Northwest, some of whom already have expressed interest in a climate workshop other than RMI. And RMI also has invited me back to lead more workshops this summer. Here's a picture of me and the guides after the workshop, and the smiles looks like the climate graphs didn't wear them down too much. Yeah. All right, I would like to thank Corey Gabriel and Jane Tyrannus on my Capstone committee and all my CSP cohort. It's been an amazing year and a lot of support, and it's been a lot of fun. We're gonna do great things. And my parents and partner Miranda for their support as well. And that's all I got. Questions?
Hello? Yeah, that was great, Eliot. It's so exciting to hear how it went and to learn more about your project. So it seems like you have, you came in with communication and like workshop guiding skills. How did you like develop your curriculum and figure out what approaches would work best to, run the workshops and do the education part of it? And then, from that, is there anything that you learned from just that experience that you could apply to future workshops that you run?
Yeah, good question. I definitely learned a lot, and I think that some data I didn't include in this was actually responses on how it could have been improved, and those were really interesting to hear from the guides that attended. And I think that as this project continues, it's going to be an ongoing learning process. And your first part of your question was, I think that how I kind of tried to design it was take a lot of the amazing research and material that I've learned here at Scripps and try and put it through the lens of how a guide might be able to utilize that information the best way. I used to be a guide before starting this program, so I was trying to think of like, if I wasn't in this program and I wanted to learn more about climate change, how would I be able to utilize some of this material in the best way, and what would be the most effective way that I could develop my own toolkit to talk about climate change with my clients. Thanks. Yeah, Eric.
Great talk, thank you very much. Totally, I'm interested in 100% your subjective opinion about the guides that you gave this talk to, or the lecture, what have you. In the survey results that you showed, there were the 2, what I would consider possibly stragglers, that were answering much lower on the results than many others. Was that potentially, like, in your opinion, could that be related to something like innate hesitancy to, like, with a personal skew towards, oh, this is a political thing, I don't want to talk about it? Or was it more of a, gee, you know, like as much as I'm a guide, I'm more of a woodsy person and I don't like talking to people. I get out in the woods to get away from people. So, you know, how much of this is, in your opinion, potentially related to, you know, this is a political thing and I don't like to talk about it, versus as my own person, I'm an introvert instead of an extrovert kind of a thing?
Yeah, great question. I could see the guides that were really excited to get more information about climate change. Like I said, that there were some questions that have come up the guides didn't feel comfortable in answering, but there were also some instances where there were some people, the guides mentioned that on tours, there would start to be some arguments. You know, someone would say, like, oh, you know, climate change isn't real or whatever. And then the guide is kind of in an interesting position that they might not want to be, you know, as involved. So I think that that was one resource that they were looking, or one way that they'd use these resources, is they could kind of quickly maybe shut people down and be like, okay, we're walking on the glacier is changing, climate change is real, this glacier is melting right over there. Though also I think that the guides themselves just were excited to develop their own means of talking about it. And I think out of anything, it seemed like the science was intimidating. That they felt like, I'm not a climate science expert, I don't have the fidelity to talk about climate change. And so that's why I was like, came into this program like, you can talk about climate change, and like I tried to give them a little script. You know, if someone asks you about the heat dome, this is what you're gonna say. But like, you have, like, learn it for yourself, this is your toolkit, do some research, you can be an expert on climate change. Yeah, great question.